Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our slide presentation of Group 19. Our topic that we chose was military rations of the American Revolution and the Civil War. Moving forward, we have our table of contents here where you can look around and see all the various topics that we're going to be covering today in today's presentation.
Summary. Group 19's mission is to properly illustrate the differences in the military rations received by the Continental Army during the American Revolution to what the Union soldiers received during the Civil War. We aim to highlight the gap between what was promised by Congress and the realities of war and how that affected the soldiers and the home front. Both the Continental and the Union soldiers were promised rations that would nourish. However, supply problems, weak logistics, and ongoing conflicts affected their daily nutrition.
American Revolution. Congressional provisions. The Continental Congress of 1775 created a standard for rations. The daily rations included 1 pound of bread, or 3 pounds of pork, or 1 pound of salted fish, 1 pound of bread or flour, 1 pint of milk, 1 quart of cider or spruce beer, and every week they got 3 pints of peas or beans. The realities. Rations were very scarce and very inconsistent, forcing the soldiers to forage for their own food or even steal from local towns. They would also get food donations from some of these towns or farms. At the beginning of the war, the general idea of how much a soldier would get was a little more consistent, but the items they would get vary from day to day.
During the Civil War, the government promised Union soldiers generous daily rations, but as the war went on and soldiers moved further away from the supply depots, the promised rations declined. The rations they were supposed to receive were 12 ounces of salt pork or bacon, 20 ounces of fresh or salt beef, 22 ounces of soft bread, hardtack, or flour to make the bread, 1.6 ounces of coffee, and 2.4 ounces of beans, peas, or rice. Here are the actual rations the soldiers received instead. Hardtack. Soldiers received about 16 ounces of this daily. This was a very hard biscuit made out of flour and water. It was mass-produced by government bakeries where they were stored for months. Because they were really hard, soldiers would force themselves to eat it, but would find creative ways like soaking them in hot water or coffee, or frying them in bacon grease. Soft bread, although very rare, was another ration. When soldiers did receive them instead of hardtack or flour, they would often receive a little less than a pound if supplies were tight. Coffee was a well-loved drink amongst the Union soldiers. Troops would receive 36 pounds a year for every Union soldier, and it was a great morale booster. Another common ration was meat. Salt pork was the most common meat ration. It was preserved by using salt, so soldiers would sometimes boil it to get rid of the saltiness and make it a little more edible. Soldiers received 12 ounces of this. And lastly, they had desiccated vegetables, which was a substitute for fresh vegetables. Soldiers usually received about a pound of it, but most refused to eat them because they were disgusting and caused diarrhea. This was a mix of vegetables like string beans, carrots, turnips, and beets that were compressed into a sort of brick shape. But as I mentioned earlier, the rations the soldiers received depended on how much the government had available at the time, which varied from day to day.
Here we have our ration comparisons between the American Revolution and the Civil War. We can see that there's obviously some noticeable similarities, like the 12 ounces of pork, but they're largely the Continental Congress at this point in both wars often give these military men the same rations, although it does vary in amount of what they give them. The bare essentials are still the same. They still get at least a portion of meat, depending on whatever it is, some form of grain, and vegetables. On the other hand, the Continental soldier during the American Revolution would have the off chance of receiving salted fish as a substitution for their meat. They could also receive milk as a substitution of a form of beverage that they were offered, and they were also Congress, funnily enough, would often give them cider or some form of alcohol to soothe these men during this rough time period. On another words, the Civil War soldier. On another words, the Union Civil War soldier would possibly receive 12 ounces of bacon instead of pork. They would receive a lot more hardtack than the Continental soldier, and they would also receive a lot more and use a lot more coffee during this time. And last but not least, the Civil War soldiers would also be given rice by chance in substitution of vegetables. Lastly, on another note, usually during the American Revolution, Continental Congress usually left it up to the states of the individual to provide their uniform, weapon, and food rations, and thus why there's like a noticeable difference of why some soldiers receive so much and whilst the other doesn't receive. And so you can see these minor different changes in why it seems like the Civil War soldiers receive more than what the American Revolution soldier would receive.
Ration conservation. In times of war, government can tend to favor the needs of their soldiers over the needs of the civilians. The ration demands of the armies were pushed to the forefront, which caused conservation and shortages on the home front. During the American Revolution, when the Continental Army lacked supplies, officials would rely on local civilians for aid through heavy purchasing or impressment, driving up food prices, causing bread, meat, flour, etc., to become unaffordable, causing turmoil on the home front with protests and riots. The Union created standardized rationing and organized transportation of supplies through the railways to ensure a constant supply. As the war prolonged, civilians were affected by higher prices and sometimes shortages. In recent times, governments push conservation onto civilians by asking them to save resources like fuel and food during wars and disasters to prioritize needs of militaries, infrastructure, and hospitals. Conclusion. From the American Revolution to the Civil War, the Congressional Provisional Military Rations has developed but still needed refining. Rations evolved from ideals to standardized systems. Continental soldiers were promised generous rations with the reality of weak systems that led them to go hungry and rely on civilian supplies and foraging. These failed systems showed the fragility of early American military provisions. The Union soldiers' rations were more consistent thanks to systems like the railroad and large-scale production. However, shortages were still occurring. The continuous innovation of the Congressional Provisional Military Rationing System is not only about feeding the soldiers on the front line, but managing the home front as well, finding a balance between the expectations of both civilians and military.
All right, I think we've reached the end. Here is our sources if you'd like to take a look at them. Group 19 would like to give a special thanks to each and everyone who've watched today's video. I hope you learned something very inspiring. And I would like to leave you off with this end card.